Hello and welcome back to Meeting Point English and part 3 of our discussion on modal auxiliary verbs. And in this one we'll be talking about modal auxiliaries used to describe obligation, prohibition, necessity and recommendation. Let's begin with obligation. Must and have to are used to express obligation. You'll see here that must is used to express the internal obligation and have to is used to express an external obligation. Now this can be confusing. This is a general tendency amongst English speakers. If you look at these two sentences, I must get up early tomorrow, I have to get up early tomorrow. Now they're both grammatically correct. There is a small tendency amongst native speakers that when the obligation is coming from the person who is speaking, we usually use must, whereas have to, the obligation is coming externally, we say, from another person. So if my intention is to get up early in the morning because I know that it's going to be a lovely sunny day and I want to make the most of my day, I might say I must get up early tomorrow because the obligation is self-imposed. It is me giving myself an obligation. If I were to say I have to get up early tomorrow, it would sound as if the obligation is coming from outside, like I have an important meeting with my boss, or I have to go to the dentist before I go to work, or I have to catch a flight, or something like that. So that is a difference between the internal and external obligation. Here's another example. You must do your homework, the teacher might say to the students. You must do your homework. You see, the obligation is coming from the speaker, the teacher. Whereas the student might say, I have to do my homework, because the obligation is coming from the teacher. So have to, and the variation that you sometimes hear have got to, is more common in speech than must, because if you think about it, the vast majority of obligations are external. They come from society, just the rules and regulations that we have to live by. You have to be 18 to vote, for example. So if you are talking about driving down the road, you would say you have to stop at a red light. If you said you must stop at a red light, it sounds a little odd. It's not really wrong, but there's that tendency if the obligation is from outside, from society, you would probably say you have to stop at a red light, the same as you have to be 18 to vote. So must is more common in written English. Applicants must be over 18 years of age. I suppose in written English the obligation is probably coming from the person writing, but must tends to appear a lot more in written English than in spoken English. So that was must and have to talk about obligations, but if we put them in the negative, they have quite a different meaning. So if you look at this sentence, you mustn't smoke in the office. Must in the negative shows prohibition. Bags must not be left unattended. This is the kind of sign you might see in an airport. That's why it didn't have a contraction there. It's a more formal notice. But this is talking about prohibition. Whereas if we take have to and make it negative, the opposite of have to is don't have to. Okay, it requires an auxiliary to make it negative. You can't say haven't to. We don't have to wear a suit on Fridays. Now, are you permitted to wear suits on Fridays? You see, you can if you want to. Don't have to shows the lack of obligation. So when we use must and mustn't, there's obligation, and the opposite of obligation is prohibition. But when we use have to Have to is obligation, but don't have to is a lack of obligation. You see, you can wear a suit on a Friday if you want to, but there is no obligation. You don't have to be tall to be a policeman these days. Okay, in the past you had to be 6 foot tall, which is 1 meter 80 something. But now you have much shorter policemen than in the past, so you don't have to be tall. There's no obligation now. So don't have to is the lack of obligation. Now let's try looking at the past tense versions of these. We had to wear a uniform at my school, but we didn't have to do much homework. So, in the past, must does not transfer into the past. Must and mustn't are only used in present tenses. We can't transfer them into the past. So the difference between the must and the have to is irrelevant when talking about the past. We can only use had to, the past tense of have to. And of course the negative form, the lack of obligation in the past, we didn't have to. Okay, so we got had to, wear a uniform, obligation in the past. Didn't have to, a lack of obligation in the past. But then if we can't use must in the past, how do we do a past prohibition? We have to use other phrases. We couldn't talk in class. That is a past prohibition. Okay, we can't use must in the past, but we can use couldn't. We weren't allowed to wear trainers. That's another way of showing a past prohibition. We weren't allowed to. Or they didn't let us play football in the playground. So phrases such as these are used to show a past prohibition. Okay, let's look at obligation and necessity. We can use the semi-modal need to express obligation and necessity. You need to work harder if you want to pass the exam. This is very similar to you should work harder if you want to pass the exam. So need to is a semi-modal. Now there are two negative forms. You can see why this is a semi-modal, because one version requires an auxiliary verb, whereas the second one you can just make a negative with need. So this is why it's a semi-modal. There are two forms. There's don't need to and there's needn't. You don't need to come to work tomorrow if you're not feeling well, or you needn't come to work tomorrow if you're not feeling well. Both of these are the same. So there are two different forms to make the negative. However, I don't need to wear glasses. So when we're talking about more general lack of necessity, we would use don't need to rather than needn't. You see, needn't is only used for a specific occasion, like tomorrow coming to work. Okay, so the first sentence there has the two options, where the second, because it's more general, we only have the one option of don't need to. Now there are two past negative forms. Okay, this is getting complicated. Didn't need to and needn't have. So there is a difference between these two. I didn't need to go to work today. It was a bank holiday. Okay, a lack of necessity. That's clear enough. Now look at this one. I needn't have gone to work today. I forgot it was a bank holiday. So needn't have refers to something that was done but was not necessary. You see, the first example, it only says that there was no necessity to go to work. It doesn't specify whether that person went to work or not. We presume they didn't go to work because it was a bank holiday. In the second sentence, they went to work, but it wasn't necessary to go to work. So I needn't have gone to work today. This is very useful in formal situations with "you needn't have bought me a present," etc. You needn't have brought a bottle of wine to the meal. Now let's look at some recommendations. To say what we think is right or wrong, we can use should and shouldn't. Very similar to "you need to study" if you're going to pass the exam. You should get a better job. You shouldn't smoke in front of the children. Okay? What we think is right and wrong in these situations. Should and shouldn't. In the past, of course, you would use should have. You should have bought the blue one, or in the negative, shouldn't have. You shouldn't have spoken to her like that. So again, we're using the modal auxiliary with have to show we're referring to the past. Ought to can also be used instead of should. It means the same thing. It's not so common these days. You ought to get some help. And the negative, of course, is ought not to. Ought not to. You ought not to do that. So ought is a little bit more complicated and, to be honest, not so common in modern speech. I think it's disappearing. You ought to get some help. You ought not to do that. For stronger recommendations, you can use must or have to. You must see this new film. It's brilliant. You have to see this new film. So I think that's all we have to say about obligation, prohibition, necessity and recommendation. I hope that's all clear to you, and I'll see you in part 4.